Hi, my name is Tessa Krempel, and I am a student physical therapist at the University of Indianapolis. I wanted to make this video as a helpful overview of sensory processing disorder, or SPD, and to provide some tips as to what you can do as a parent or caregiver of a child with sensory processing disorder. Note that SPD used to be called sensory integration dysfunction, so you may find some resources that still use the old terminology. I'll be referencing 3 books during this video, one of which is Sensational Kids by Lucy Jane Miller, and I thought she did a good job at giving a brief definition of sensory processing and sensory processing disorder. She states, sensory processing is a term that refers to the way the nervous system receives sensory messages and turns them into responses. Sensory processing disorder, SPD, exists when sensory signals are not organized into appropriate responses. As a result, a child's daily routines and activities are disrupted. Atypical responses to sensory messages can be behavioral, emotional, or attention-related, or they can manifest as problems with motor abilities or organization. Other problems that typically result include poor social participation, problems with self-regulation, and impaired self-esteem. We all know about our 5 basic senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, but we don't typically talk about our 3 other or hidden senses of proprioception, vestibular, and interoception. Proprioception is what gives us an awareness of the pressure on our joints and muscles and the position of our bodies. Our vestibular sense contributes to balance, movement, and our head's relationship to gravity, like when we fall or we get dizzy. And lastly, our interoceptive sense is what tells us what's going on inside our body, like needing to go to the bathroom, having a stomach ache, etc. The information from our senses helps us function appropriately. They let us know what's going on both in our environment and within our own bodies. Sometimes they will warn us that something doesn't feel right or we're unsafe, like there's a spider on our back, or there's a loud noise that startles us, or maybe we have a stomach bug. Other times, they can tell us that we're safe and something is good, such as the taste of chocolate, the smell of flowers, or a comforting hug, or maybe the sound of a familiar voice like a parent. However, in order to give us the right information and for us to adapt to it appropriately, our senses have to all be working together. We learn from our senses without even thinking about it. Exposure and response to sensory stimulation looks different depending on what stage of development a child is in. For example, infants are mostly concerned with feeding, being held, sleeping, crying to communicate when they're hungry or need a diaper change, or maybe they're hot or cold. They'll babble or coo, and they respond to familiar and comforting sounds. Toddlers, they're exposed to more textured foods and messy play. They begin purposeful play. They're typically walking, running, jumping, climbing stairs, and discovering gravity if they haven't yet through falling. They begin to use some verbal communication, etc. Preschoolers begin to have increased independence with eating, dressing, toiling. They learn higher level motor skills like skipping, hopping, throwing a ball, and they use more full sentences. They may not be grammatically correct, but they're full sentences. They also show food preferences, learn some body awareness, and are able to maintain their attention in preparation for actual school. And children develop and learn by taking in information from their senses, and they learn to associate consequences, good or bad, with different sensations and experiences. Children with SPD struggle with making these connections and are sometimes referred to as the problem child, or maybe they have behavior issues. Well, this is an unnecessary and unhelpful label. Instead of labeling children as the problem children, let's see what we as the adults in their lives can do to help them cope with their sensory processing problems. Over the next 2 slides, we'll go over some age-related signs and symptoms of sensory processing disorder. These are commonly used checklists, but are not meant to replace a formal sensory processing evaluation. However, if your child demonstrates multiple of these characteristics, I encourage you to listen to the rest of this video to see if you should have a conversation about SPD with your child's pediatrician and what you can do to best help your child. One of an infant's most primary skills is feeding and exploring their environment orally. So difficulty feeding or avoiding mouthing toys is a common early sign of sensory processing disorder and related conditions. During your child's infancy, you may also notice them resisting being held, touched, or cuddled. Maybe they only like being held or cuddled by you as a parent or a caregiver, but they may not even like you touching them. They may arch away, cry, or squirm from your touch. They may also avoid eye contact or looking at toys. They may be distressed during bathing, diaper changes, or changing clothes, more so than usual. They may seem unaware of noise or take a while to respond or startle easily at familiar sounds that wouldn't typically alarm a child of a similar age. They may also be having difficulty getting to sleep. They may be sensitive to light, and they may dislike having their head tipped back, being placed on their back, or being lifted up from the ground in general. Many of these warning signs and symptoms encompass developmental stages from late infancy to after toddlerhood and can become more apparent as the child gets older. As your child approaches and is in toddlerhood, you may notice him or her withdrawing from situations, taking a long time to respond to familiar voices or when their name is called. They may startle easily, particularly to what you would think are familiar sounds or maybe not too loud to you. They may be distracted in noisy environments. They may enjoy looking at spinning objects like the wheels on a toy car or a fan. They may avoid eye contact, take a long time to adapt to the daylight, possibly squinting excessively or avoiding too much brightness, like preferring to be in the dark or playing in the basement. They may resist being held or cuddled. They may become agitated when having their hair washed or their face wiped. They may become upset with messy play or not realize when their face or hands are dirty. They may have difficulty with feeding or avoid physical activities and seem weak or heavy when you pick them up. They may become upset when placed on their back or cry when being moved. They may chew on non-food objects or mouth objects excessively. They may avoid certain food textures or temperatures, and they may refuse to drink from a cup. First, let's take a brief look at some of the types and subtypes of sensory processing disorder. We'll mainly focus on sensory modulation disorder and the three subtypes of over-responsivity, also called sensory defensiveness, under-responsivity, and sensory craving. Children with over-responsivity have a quicker and more intense response to sensory stimuli. Because of this, experiencing anxiety and having trouble with transitions is common for these kiddos. They tend to find comfort in avoiding change due to the stress of an overstimulating world. As infants, these kiddos may cry or arch their back from being held or having their diapers or clothes changed. As toddlers, they may become seemingly obsessed with avoiding messy things or certain textures or types of clothing. As the name suggests, children with under-responsivity take longer to respond or have less of a response to things. They may also require a more intense or long-lasting stimulus before responding. For instance, the example of when a child may not respond to their name being called. These kiddos tend to be socially withdrawn and may not notice or care if other children are inviting them to play. As infants, they may be seen as a quiet baby or a good baby, but their under-responsive tendencies are later seen during toddlerhood through potty training problems, low and slow activity levels, and decreased social interaction. As this name also suggests, sensory craving kiddos crave sensory input, but often to a dysfunctional and inappropriate level. These are the kiddos who are always on the go and getting into things and are more likely to be mislabeled as a problem child. It's normal for every child to seek sensory stimulation, but it's important to recognize when children are sensory craving to the point of dysfunction and potential harm to themselves or others. The symptoms of sensory craving are often confused with ADHD due to their hyperactive tendencies. To further get a feel for how children of each type of sensory modulation disorder may act, let's take a look at a playground scenario. It's a typical playground. There are other kids playing and shouting, dogs are barking, airplanes are flying overhead, it's sunny, and the ground is slightly wet and maybe muddy. If your child is over-responsive, he or she may prefer to stay away from other kids, cover their ears in response to loud noises, such as the dog barking, the airplane flying overhead, and the other kids. They may close or squint their eyes or prefer to stay in the shade in response to the bright sun. He or she may also be bothered by getting wet and muddy, avoid the swings or become upset when put on the swing, or avoid touching things or being touched, or avoid running, climbing, and jumping. If your child is under-responsive, he or she may prefer to play alone and seem tuned out or in their own little world. They may have trouble responding to you calling their name and may not really notice getting muddy. He or she may not seem bothered by bumping into things, sustaining minor injuries, falling over objects, and may fall often. And lastly, if your child is sensory craving, they may act like a daredevil on the swing, slide, trees, merry-go-round, etc. These kiddos may shove other kids and want to touch everything, jump off of things without fear, put inedible things in their mouths, seem constantly on the move and getting into everything, and may approach the stranger's barking dog without fear. But before we go any further, let's discuss some caveats to these checklists and signs. In her novel, The Out of Sync Child, Carol Stock Kranowitz outlines 5 caveats to using checklists. Firstly, children with sensory dysfunction do not need to exhibit every characteristic on a checklist to have SPD. For example, the child with vestibular dysfunction may have poor balance but good muscle tone. Second, children may show characteristics of a dysfunction one day but not the next. For instance, the child with proprioceptive problems may trip over every bump in the pavement on Friday, yet score every soccer goal on Saturday. It's important to note that inconsistency is a hallmark of every neurological dysfunction. Third, children may exhibit characteristics of a particular dysfunction, yet not have that dysfunction. For example, the child who typically withdraws from being touched may seem to be oversensitive to tactile stimulation, but may instead have an emotional problem. Therefore, I strongly encourage you to discuss any concern with your child's pediatrician prior to making assumptions about a potential diagnosis. Fourth, a child may be both hypersensitive and hyposensitive, or over-responsive and under-responsive, as we've talked about previously. For instance, the child may be extremely sensitive to light touch, jerking away from a soft pat on the shoulder, but be indifferent to the deep pain from getting shots. And lastly, everyone has some sensory integration problems now and then, because no one is well regulated all the time. All kinds of stimuli can temporarily disrupt normal functioning of the brain, either by overloading it with or depriving it of sensory stimulation. For example, have you ever been driving in an unfamiliar area or in traffic and needed to turn down the volume on the radio so you can see or focus better? The volume shouldn't be related to your driving, but at that moment, the loud music was too much for your system to try to ignore or process in order to focus on your driving. The same author who wrote The Out of Sync Child, Carol Stock Kranowitz, also wrote a book with what she calls safe activities you can do with your kiddo with sensory processing disorder. These activities are termed safe for sensory motor, appropriate, fun, and easy. These activities give kiddos a chance to regulate their systems and work on coping with sensory processing disorder in a fun and active way. Before we get into the different safe activities, let's briefly touch on the do's and don'ts. Do. Start where your child is developmentally. Starting them on an activity that is too advanced for their stage of development could set them up for failure, which would be counterproductive. Do play outdoors whenever possible. The outdoor environment is full of sensory stimulation, which can be challenging for kids, but is vital to them learning to self-regulate. Speaking of self-regulation, note the child's self-therapy. If your child likes to spin in circles, consider activities that incorporate spinning as an appropriate outlet. But if your child is a sensory avoider and doesn't like messy play, respect this and ease them into the activity through no mess messy play, which we will touch on in the next slide. Next, do build on the child's particular interests. Do offer safe activities that will instill a sense of control. Do take immediate advantage of a successful, safe activity. Do try again, and maybe with some adjustments to help your child be more successful. Do use safe activities as complements to a sensory diet. A sensory diet is a program specifically designed for your child and can only be designed by a certified OT or PT. So while these activities are good, they are only meant to supplement or be side dishes to an official sensory diet. And do let your child do. Children learn by doing rather than having everything done for them. So give your child some freedom to figure out these activities and have fun. Now for the don'ts. When doing these activities, don't continue an activity if your child becomes distressed. With many of these activities, less is sometimes and more often more. So too much stimulation can potentially set them back and be counterproductive. And lastly, don't think that these activities will fix children with SPD. As I stated before, these activities are not to replace formal treatment of kiddos with SPD, but are generally safe and beneficial when using common sense and good judgment, with exception of kiddos who are medically fragile. Over the next 7 slides, I will be delving deeper into some brief checklists for each sense and what safe at-home interventions would be appropriate in addition to outpatient therapy. For touch, or the tactile sense, an over-responsive kiddo may avoid touching messy textures such as shaving cream, finger paint, dirt, sand. They may also rub off kisses or casual touches, and they may be bothered by types of clothing worn, particularly sock seams, shoes, or tags. Under-responsive kiddos to the tactile sense may not notice when their hands or face are messy, may not notice when their clothes are twisted, and they may be unaware of touch or pain and may unintentionally hurt pets or other people. Kiddos who are tactilely sensory craving may seek out experiences to touch things, constantly fidget with an object, purposely swat at toys, and chew on inedible things like shirt collars, sleeves, toys, and pencils. Some safe at-home interventions would be to use unpaint, like shaving cream, damp sand, slime, and just paint or play with the unpaint. You can play on a tray or on the kitchen counter, on windows, any surface that you don't mind them playing at, and encouraging them to play in an appropriate way. You can also use Play-Doh or Theraputty. Play-Doh, everybody knows what Play-Doh is, but Theraputty, it is similar to Play-Doh, but it can come in different weights. So depending on what you want to get out of an activity, you can use different types of Theraputties. You can also use dry foods in a bin, like beans, rice, oatmeal, etc. That can provide a nice and clean way to get different tactile stimulus. Go away glue is a great coping game. So especially if you have a kiddo who is over responsive to messy play or any kind of touch, really, you can play go away glue and it becomes more of a game. So if they get messy, You can teach them to kind of wipe it away, and then it can become a pretend play game where you kind of become dramatic with them, and you're like, go away, glue, and you start wiping it off of your whole body. And you can help them with this through deep pressure on them, because a lot of kiddos who are over responsive to touch are actually, they actually like deep pressure, like deep hugs versus a kiss. A kiss is more of a light touch that they might wipe away. So go away glue can be kind of a fun, and it becomes ridiculous if you're saying there's glue all over your whole body, but in reality, maybe there's a little bit of shaving cream on their hand. So another really easy thing that you can do, but can also be pretty challenging for these kiddos, is playing in grass, especially for young ones who maybe have never been able to play in the grass. Grass is kind of intimidating, so playing in the grass can be good. It's also good to regulate kiddos who are under-responsive or sensory craving, so you can make them focus and maybe try to find some white beans or something that you put out in the grass or something, and kind of encouraging them to focus on that activity. You can also do a hot dog roll. You can use a sleeping bag or a large beach ball, something like that for deep pressure. Like I said, they can also be a taco, where you just use the sleeping bag, a bean bag, or a large beach ball, and or even just a hug, can give them that deep pressure to help regulate them. And a lot of kiddos really like this. And another fun thing is that you can play dress up. So playing dress up can kind of encourage them to cope with wearing different types of clothing, and especially for the over-responsive kiddos, but under-responsive kiddos, this can help them to notice when clothes are twisted, and be more self-aware with those things. So some tips, specifically some coping tips, are to start by using utensils during messy play, or you can put the unpaint in a Ziploc bag and they can squish it. You could maybe even put some beads or something, or glitter inside that they can look for to motivate them to play with it. You can have them wear gloves, as long as that doesn't overstimulate them even more. And I would encourage you to use, if they like it, some deep pressure activities like the hot dog roll or something before and or after a stimulating tactile activity that is maybe more challenging for them, like the messy play, for instance. Now for body position, or the proprioceptive sense. Kiddos who are over-responsive to proprioception may be unable to sit for long periods of time due to discomfort, and they may avoid jumping or bouncing activities. Kiddos who are under-responsive may slouch when sitting in a chair or on the floor, sit in one position for long periods of time, and lean on people or things and invade others' body space. Kiddos who are sensory craving may seem to always be jumping or bouncing, and they may crash into couch cushions or a bed mattress at home or push others. Some at-home interventions would be to use that crash pad or large inner tubes for that deep pressure and getting that input to help regulate themselves. You can also use an activity like Become a Butterfly, or the hot dog roll, like we talked about in the previous slide. Become a Butterfly is the same thing, where you would use like a sleeping bag or something where it would be their cocoon or chrysalis, and you can apply the deep pressure there, squish them a little bit, and they become a butterfly, or they could be a hot dog, or they could be a taco, whatever creative game you guys want to play. Another really kind of cheap way to get these kiddos their input is to have them push, pull, or carry heavy items, such as a grocery cart. It may be at the shopping center, or it could just be a toy grocery cart. And you can also use a laundry basket, fill it with some weight, whether that's laundry for smaller kiddos or some at-home weights or anything you can really think of that is appropriate for them. And you could even maybe race them and make it fun. You could also fill empty soft drink bottles, and that could be something they can carry around. If you fill it up with liquid, that can be fun, especially with glitter, food dye, but I would suggest playing with that exclusively outside in case those pop. You can also practice doing a wheelbarrow exercise. You could do wheelbarrow races, and you can also fill pillowcases with things. You can have them push on a wall, maybe pretend like you're holding up the wall, or make it fun. And you can also do yard work or chores. It sounds weird to us, I feel like, because it's a chore to us, but kids will sometimes find these activities to be really fun. So you can sweep, you can mop, do laundry, wipe off a table, give the dog a bath, rake the grass or leaves, dig dirt to plant flowers, etc. And as they get older, participating in sports can really, really help these kiddos. Any type of physical activity, especially when it's organized, can really help to regulate them and help with understanding where their body is positioned and just give them that needed input. If your kiddos like to eat chewy or crunchy foods, and they're demonstrating some of these characteristics, I encourage you to possibly, if they're old enough, have them chew gum or eat chewy or crunchy foods to give them that deep pressure input. Especially if they like to grind their teeth, this is a good alternative to that. And I'm sure a lot of dentists would agree with me. Some tips, really just find a go-to activity with your child so that your child can use this to self-regulate. So if they're feeling overwhelmed and they can't focus because they're constantly on the go, bouncing, jumping, and they just need to regulate themselves, maybe they, really connect with the pushing the wall thing. So encourage them if you notice that they're starting to get too wound up or fidgety and they can't focus on what they need to. Encourage them to push on the wall or do whatever activity they find fun that gives you some good results. Now for the vestibular sense, or balance and movement. So a kiddo who is over-responsive to this sense may refuse to swing, slide, or spin, or be upside down, anything like that. They may be anxious when climbing or when feet leave the ground, and they may dislike their head being tipped back, such as shampooing over the sink. Kiddos who are under-responsive to the vestibular sense may not get dizzy when spinning, and they may have poor balance, falling often, and they may enjoy being upside down. Kiddos who are sensory craving for the vestibular sense enjoy climbing or jumping from tall heights. Maybe they tend to get into these bouts of constant spinning, climbing, rolling, running, etc. And they may act like what we would say a daredevil, having, some decreased sensory and safety awareness. Some safe at-home interventions would be to sit on what they call a tea stool, which is basically a stool that looks like a T. You make it out of two pieces of wood, and so they have to try to balance both side to side and front and back. Or you could have them sit on like a therapy ball or something that is a little bit wobbly, so they have to balance. You can also use a mini trampoline or some gentle roughhousing activities like rowboat, airplane, horsey, wheelbarrow walk, and double dancer. You could do a laundromat game where they're in a sheet and you can kind of use it as a sack and swing them a little bit, very gently, or however you can do safely. Where maybe you throw some balls in there or some bean bags, and that's the laundry detergent. You can also do the same hot dog roll and become a butterfly game that we talked about previously. You can also use a swing. You could give them a bat or a stick that they can either swing on their tummy or safely sitting, where they have to hit a ball on a tee or a target or something, or kick a ball to a target, or however you guys want to play a game that just has a goal in mind and they're having fun and you're having fun. You can also simulate maybe an earthquake or something in a hammock, or similarly with the laundromat game, you can make kind of a hammock out of a sheet or something. And another simple thing, just rolling down hills. Some tips for these activities would be to start by sitting against a wall when you're using the tea stool or ball or any type of seated balance stuff, so that they don't have to worry about balancing themselves too much forward and backward, but only side to side. And once they master that, have them do it both ways. Another thing is that with all of these activities, but with the vestibular sense in particular, less is sometimes more. So keep an eye on how they're doing. Are they still smiling? Are they still having fun? Are they still able to complete these activities? So if you're playing the game with, kicking or hitting a ball at a target while swinging, and they start just swinging the bat and not hitting the target anymore, or they start throwing things more, maybe they've become overstimulated. So just keep an eye out for that and help to regulate them. So if they get overstimulated, go back to your go-to activity like the deep pressure. But all of these activities are safe when using general common sense and just being attentive to your child. These activities are meant to be used with adult supervision, so just keep an eye out for how your child is doing and just use your best judgment. For the auditory sense or sound, over-responsive kiddos may cover their ears in noisy environments, make noises to drown out other loud noises, and they may be unable to focus on one voice or sound with the presence of background noise. They may also be distressed by sounds that don't typically bother others. Under-responsive kiddos may not respond to their name being called or require visual or tactile cues to gain their attention. Sensory craving kiddos for the auditory sense may request music that is fast and or loud and make noises in quiet environments. Some safe at-home interventions are as follows. You can use a slide whistle stretch, so you can have a slide whistle toy and you can have them kind of stretch their arms up as you slide the whistle, or it could be a different type of toy, but it makes it fun when they have to stretch their arms out and get really, really big, or maybe they have to get really, really small. Something fun and interactive like that. can kind of get them used to maybe a high-pitched whistle sound. You can also do games like red light, green light. So they have to be attentive and listen to, is the command red light or is it green light, and move their body accordingly. You can also do fun crafts like making your own instruments. It could be as simple as a wood block and mallet, or you can use sticks, or drums, which can just be pots, pans, bowls if you'd like. You can also make fun maracas, a little box guitar with rubber bands, things like that. You can also do a tapping tunes game where you tap a beat and they have to either guess the tune if they're old enough or maybe repeat it. And you can also play like musical chairs or hoops with like hula hoops, and they have to pay attention to when the music starts and stops. Some tips with the auditory sense. You can start with instruments that make lower pitches, because higher pitches tend to be what kiddos who are over-responsive tend to dislike. You can also consider headphones in loud environments, and adjusting your volume, pitch, and speed at which you talk to either gain your child's attention, maintain it, or just bring them to the level they need to be. So if they're really energetic, you can whisper or talk slowly, quiet, calm, to try to get them back down. Or if they are under-responsive and they're not responding to their name or to the situation, you can use your voice as a way to bring their energy level up. For sight or the vision sense, kiddos who are over-responsive may avoid being in a room with bright lights. They may prefer to play in the basement or someplace that's dimly lit. They may have difficulty focusing on a busy or disordered picture, such as I spy images. Kiddos who are under-responsive may complain that their eyes are tired when looking at a book. They may have difficulty focusing on a still image or have difficulty tracking objects as they move. Kids who are sensory craving for the vision sense may stand in front of a mirror or reflective surface for a long time, and they may like to look at spinning wheels, fans, or spin themselves and intently watch that. Some safe at-home interventions would be to use a picture schedule board if the child's old enough, so that they can see what is part of their daily schedule and visualize it in a picture format, and give them kind of some structure, and they can associate, okay, this picture of breakfast, that's when we have breakfast, or okay, I have soccer practice today, so there's a soccer ball on today's spot in the afternoon. You can also do bottle bowling, so you can set up some empty bottles or whatever you have, and they can work on aiming or rolling a ball or whatever you have. Maybe it's an orange, because the next activity is the citrus balls. In this book, they just say citrus balls, and there's all these different activities you can do that are sensory activities, and you can have them look at different types. So maybe there's grapefruit, oranges, lemons, limes, and they look at them and identify what type of citrus it is. And then you can have them juice it, and you get to drink the juice and whatever you want to make, and it's a fun activity. You could also make magnetic fish with a paper fish and a little paper clip, and then you tie a magnet to the end of a string attached to a stick, and there you go. And this forces them to focus on one fish at a time, and it's a good fine motor activity, but also a sensory activity. You can also do a sandbox hunt. Or it doesn't have to be in a sandbox, but something where you've hidden maybe some smaller toys and amongst sand or beans or oatmeal or rice, and they have to look for it. And simple as I Spy. I Spy is a good activity. You can also have them stack blocks or boxes, anything that requires them to focus and distinguish different objects. Some tips would be to try starting the activities in a dimly lit room and increase light as tolerated if your child is more sensitive to bright lights. And if your child is unable to engage, take a break, turn the lights off, or switch activities. Now on to taste or the gustatory sense. Over-responsive kiddos for taste may eat a limited number of food textures and also prefer bland foods. They may be labeled as a picky eater. Under-responsive kiddos may prefer tangy, spicy, sour food, really wanting those strong flavors. Sensory craving kiddos may tend to overstuff their mouth and may lick inedible objects such as Play-Doh and toys. Safe at-home interventions would be things like taste and tell, which would be an activity where either they see the food or maybe you have them blindfolded. It depends on their comfort level, but you can have them taste whatever it is and tell you what they think it is. So maybe it's peanut butter, and see if they can identify it just from taste or help them to associate this is peanut butter, this is what it tastes like. You can also have them do some new taste sensations, themed sensory food and play. So you can have, let's say, you play a game that has hoops or something, and you have them eat SpaghettiOs or donuts, something that is themed. So you could also have them, maybe they're bowling, and you have them eat blueberries or things that are round. Just fun things that are themed, and so they get to play a game, and the food that goes with it is kind of related. So, or you could also have them, maybe they're stomping on bubble wrap and they eat crunchy foods, something fun like that. You can also just have them play chef, either for real or pretend, but I would encourage, if they're old enough and with your supervision, to help them help you in the kitchen. And since they made it, they may be more inclined to try it. Some tips would be to offer and encourage, but do not force, especially the taste and tell activity, on a picky eater. And lastly, smell, or the olfactory sense. Now, these signs you'll see are pretty similar to taste, and that's because taste and smell are very well connected. So, over-responsive kiddos, they may not seem to notice foul or strong odors. In sensory craving kiddos, they may tend to smell perfumes and colognes on other people. Some safe at-home interventions would be a smell and tell game, very similar to the taste and tell, which is also a good activity. So the smell and tell would be, you have different items that have a distinct smell to them in jars. Maybe they're covered, and you have them smell it and try to tell you what it is simply by the smell. You can also do a smash and spell flower paper activity, where you go out with your kid and you go pick flowers and you put them on paper and put another piece of paper or something on top and either smash them with a mallet, or maybe you roll them with a roller, and you can get all those flowery juices kind of flowing into the paper, And it kind of makes a pretty wrapping paper or craft paper that smells like flowers. They can smell it, and it's a pleasant and fun activity. Some tips. So if your child is having trouble with the guessing games, you can have the items in clear plastic bags to help them associate sight with smell, which is a really good sensory activity. But I would also caution you to beware of too strong of smells, which can cause headaches. So just keep an eye out for that. You don't want to do this activity for too long, especially if you have like strong essential oils or things like that going on. Another thing I want to touch on is the effect of prematurity and or a NICU stay on a child's sensory processing and how it can be connected with sensory processing disorder. So the NICU is not an ideal environment for an infant's developing sensory system. Additionally, babies born prematurely must begin processing sensory information earlier than intended for their typical development. So let's just compare and contrast these two different columns for infants who go straight home and infants who have a NICU stay. So, infants at home. These kiddos are held almost immediately. Yes, there's the typical medical checking of things like reflexes and all the stuff that goes on, but day one, they're held by parents and they are swaddled and get a lot of good, comforting sensory input, whereas infants in the NICU, yes, they may be held, but there's a lot of medical things going on that prevent them from getting as much of that comforting swaddling and being held by the parents and or medical healthcare providers. Infants at home, they're feeding orally. Maybe they're nursing or by bottle, but if they're going straight home, they're typically feeding by mouth. Infants in the NICU, they may have NG or G tube feedings. These are very common. So they're not getting the same taste and oral and smell senses that we talked about before. Infants at home, when they're brought home, there's typically a quiet and peaceful environment and they're not being poked and prodded. Whereas infants in the NICU, it's a very disruptive environment and it's never completely quiet or dark. They try, but it's just just the environment of the NICU, it's kind of hard to keep it at that appropriate level. Infants at home. So physiological flexion. This is when hands and feet are to midline, and this begins at 36 weeks gestation, and it helps the child with self-soothing. So they can bring their hands to the face, suck their thumb, etc. And it gives good proprioceptive input before and after birth. So premature infants, they may not have physiological flexion yet, so they may not be able to effectively self-soothe by bringing their hands to their midline and suck their thumb and bring their hands to their face. So infants at home, because of all this, they'll associate touch with enjoyable feeding, cuddling, comfort, etc. While infants in the NICU, they may associate touch, their face especially, with discomfort and being poked and prodded. Infants at home, their nervous system is ready to accept, adapt to, and learn from sensory input, typically. Whereas infants in the NICU, especially premature infants, their system is not fully ready or is overwhelmed by the amount of input. So another thing to note is difficulty feeding and or oral defensiveness is a common and early symptom of SPD and similar diagnoses. So the child may be called a picky eater later. If your child demonstrates some of these signs and symptoms, he or she could have SPD or something else might be going on, such as attention deficit disorder, ADD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, ASD, vision problems, learning disabilities, nutritional deficits or eating problems, speech or articulation difficulties, auditory or language problems. This is not a complete list because there are many different things that are look-alike symptoms to SPD. Therefore, if your child exhibits some of the aforementioned signs and symptoms, it is important to consult your child's pediatrician to discuss whether SPD is an appropriate diagnosis for your child. There are specialists in this area, typically occupational therapists, who are trained in treating sensory processing disorder and similar conditions, and they can create an intervention plan specific to your child's needs. This slide just has the books that I used primarily to make this presentation, and I would definitely recommend any one of them for a parent or caregiver of a child with sensory processing disorder. And here are the rest of my references. I hope you found this video to be helpful. Thank you for watching.